Billionaire yells at Waitress for smiling too much. She says one line that ends it all. The crystal chandeliers of Le Bernardin cast golden light across the marble floors, each table dressed in crisp white linens that cost more than most people's. Weekly groceries. It was the kind of place where a single meal could pay someone's rent, where the wine list read like a small mortgage, and where the wealthy came not just to eat, but to be seen. Emma had been working there for 3 months. Now, her smile as much a part of her uniform as the pressed black vest and pristine white gloves, she needed this job desperately. Her mother's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves, but she refused to let the weight of her struggles show on her face. That Tuesday evening started like any other. The dinner rush was in full swing, the kitchen humming with controlled chaos while she glided between tables, refilling water glasses before they emptied, clearing plates with practiced grace. She had just finished serving the ambassador's table when Marcus Blackwood walked in. Everyone knew who he was. You couldn't live in New York without seeing his face on magazine covers, his name on buildings, his influence spreading through the city like veins through marble. Worth $12 billion, they said. Owner of half the commercial real estate in Manhattan. The kind of man who could buy and sell entire neighborhoods on a whim. He didn't wait to be seated. Men like Marcus. Blackwood never waited for anything. He simply walked to the corner table, the one with the best view of Central Park, and the couple already sitting there quickly gathered their things and left without a word of protest. Emma watched from across the room as her manager practically sprinted over, bowing and scraping, assuring Mr. Blackwood that everything would be perfect. Absolutely perfect. Then the manager's eyes found Emma, and with a subtle but urgent gesture, he summoned her over. She approached with her usual warmth, notepad ready, that genuine smile still playing on her lips. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Le Bernardin. May I start you with something to drink?" Marcus didn't look up from his phone. His fingers moved across the screen with sharp, aggressive taps, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "Macallan. Neat. 30-year. Emma nodded, writing it down even though she'd already memorized it. "Excellent choice, sir. I'll have that right. Did I ask for your opinion?" His voice cut through her sentence like a blade through silk. For the first time, he looked up, and his eyes were cold as winter stone. Emma's smile never wavered, though something inside her chest tightened. "My apologies, sir. I'll get your drink immediately." She turned to leave, but his voice followed her. "And stop smiling so much. It's irritating. Nobody's that happy." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Emma paused for just a heartbeat, her back to him, before continuing to the bar. Her hands remained steady as she placed the order, but the bartender, Miguel, saw something in her eyes. "You okay?" he whispered. Emma nodded, that smile still there, though now it felt heavier on her face. "Just another Tuesday," she said softly, taking the crystal tumbler of whiskey and heading back. As she set the drink down, Marcus was back, on his phone, barking orders at someone unfortunate enough to be on the other end. "I don't care what the contract says. Find a loophole. That's what I pay you for." He ended the call with a vicious tap and took a sip of his whiskey, his eyes finding Emma again. "You're still smiling." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "What's wrong with you? Nobody working a job like this has any reason to smile. It's fake. It's pathetic." Emma felt heat rise to her cheeks, but her professional mask held firm. "Would you like to hear tonight's specials, sir?" Marcus slammed his hand on the table, making the crystal tumbler jump. Several nearby diners turned to look. "I asked you a question. What kind of person grins like an idiot while serving other people's food? You think this is some kind of performance? You think I came here to see your cheerful little act?" The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Conversations at nearby tables died to whispers. A woman in pearls at the adjacent table shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while her husband suddenly became very interested in his soup. Emma stood there, notepad still in hand, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on her. But instead of shrinking, something else stirred inside her. Not anger exactly, but a kind of quiet strength she didn't know she possessed. The smile on her face shifted slightly, becoming something more genuine, more knowing. And in that moment, watching this billionaire's face twisted with inexplicable rage over something as simple as human kindness, she realized she was looking at someone far more broken than she'd ever be, no matter how many bills piled up at home, no matter how many nights she went to bed hungry so her mother could eat. The storm was coming. She could feel it building in the silence between them, but for now, she simply stood there, waiting, that smile still gently defying everything he represented. The whispers started within seconds of Marcus Blackwood's outburst, rippling through the restaurant like waves across still water. In the kitchen, the sous chef pressed his face to the window of the swinging door, whispering urgently to the line cooks. "That's him. That's actually him. The one who fired 300 people last Christmas Eve." The prep cook, barely 21, shook his head in disbelief. "Just like that?" The sous chef nodded grimly. "By email, while they were home with their families. Said it was restructuring for efficiency." At the hostess stand, Rebecca clutched her reservation tablet with white knuckles, leaning close to James, the sommelier. "My cousin worked at one of his hotels," she breathed, keeping her voice below the soft jazz playing overhead. "Said he made a housekeeper cry because she forgot to fold the toilet paper into a point. Screamed at her for 15 minutes about attention to detail while she stood there sobbing." James winced, his eyes tracking to where Emma still stood, by Blackwood's table, maintaining that remarkable composure. "She doesn't know what she's dealing with," he muttered. "Remember what happened to that waiter at the plaza? Blackwood had him blacklisted from every high-end restaurant in the city. Kid had to move back to Ohio." The stories spread from table to table, each whisper adding another layer to the mythology of Marcus Blackwood's cruelty. The couple at table 12 had heard about the time he sued his own nephew over a family business dispute. The businessman at the bar knew someone who'd watched Blackwood destroy a small company just because they'd outbid him on a piece of art he wanted. Everyone had a story, a warning, a cautionary tale about crossing the man who owned half of Manhattan's skyline. Emma heard none of these whispers, but she didn't need to. She could feel the fear in the air, thick as humidity before a storm. Her manager, David, hovered near the kitchen door, his face pale and sweaty, clearly torn between protecting his employee and protecting his restaurant from the wrath of Marcus Blackwood. She caught his eye for a moment, and he made a subtle gesture. Switch tables, let someone else handle this. But Emma gave the slightest shake of her head. No, she wouldn't run. Back in the server's station, the other waitstaff huddled together like soldiers in a foxhole. "She should just apologize," whispered Carla, who'd been working there for 5 years. "Just say sorry, stop smiling, get through the night." But Tom, the oldest server on staff, shook his gray head slowly. "You didn't see her eyes," he said, quietly. "That girl's got steel in her spine. She's not backing down." "Then she's an idiot," Carla shot back, but her voice lacked conviction. "Because they all saw it. Something in the way Emma stood, the way she held herself despite the hurricane of malice directed at her. She wasn't defiant exactly, wasn't aggressive or confrontational. She was simply unmovable, like a lighthouse, standing firm against crashing waves." Marcus, meanwhile, had returned to his phone, but his agitation was visible in every movement. He scrolled through emails with violent swipes, deleted messages with particular venom, all while shooting dark glances at Emma as she served other tables. She continued her work with the same grace, the same genuine warmth, that smile never quite leaving her face. It was driving him insane, and everyone could see it. The investment banker at table 8 leaned over to his wife. $20 says he gets her fired before dessert." His wife frowned, watching Emma help an elderly woman with her coat. "That's horrible. She's just doing her job." But even she couldn't hide her nervousness, her eyes darting between Emma and the billionaire like she was watching a nature documentary about a gazelle grazing too close to a lion. The tension built with each passing minute. When Emma refilled water glasses at a nearby table, Marcus's jaw clenched tighter. When she laughed softly at something a child said, his fingers drummed against the table with barely contained fury. The entire restaurant had become a stage, and everyone was waiting for the second act of this uncomfortable drama. Miguel, the bartender, had seen enough. During a brief lull, he pulled Emma aside near the service bar. "Emma, mi amor, you need to be careful. This man, he's not just rich. He's powerful. He's dangerous." Emma's smile finally softened, became something more real, more tired. "Miguel, my mother is dying of cancer. I watch her fade a little more every day. I hold her hand through chemotherapy that we can barely afford. I've seen real danger, real pain." She glanced back at Marcus Blackwood, still scowling at his phone. "That man, he's just angry at a smile. Can you imagine living with that much rage over something so small?" Miguel wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she didn't understand the kind of damage men like Blackwood could do, but something in her eyes stopped him. There was a wisdom there, earned through suffering, that made his warnings feel suddenly hollow. "Just be careful," he said finally. Emma touched his arm gently. "I'm always careful, Miguel, but I won't let him take my smile. It's the one thing that's still mine." As she walked back onto the floor, the whispers followed her like a cape. Some admired her courage, others thought she was foolish, but everyone, from the busboys to the boutique owners dining on expense accounts, watched with the kind of attention usually reserved for tightrope walkers working without a net. Because that's what this felt like, a balancing act between dignity and disaster, with no safe way down. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another degree as Marcus Blackwood raised his hand, snapping his fingers with the sharp crack of breaking bones. The gesture was deliberate, designed to humiliate, to reduce Emma from a person to a servant, from a human being to a tool for his convenience. Every eye in the restaurant turned to watch as she approached his table once more, that inexplicable smile still gracing her features despite everything. The storm that had been building all evening was about to break, and everyone could feel it in their bones, like the pressure drop before lightning strikes. The snap of Marcus Blackwood's fingers echoed through the restaurant like a gunshot. Emma approached his table with measured steps, her notepad ready. That smile still present but somehow different now, deeper, more knowing, as if she understood something about this moment that he didn't. "Yes, sir? How may I help you?" Marcus's face had turned an unhealthy shade of red, the veins in his temple visible even in the golden lighting. "I want to speak to your manager. Now. You're done here." The words fell like a judge's gavel, final and absolute. David, the manager, was already halfway across the dining room, his face a mask of professional panic. The entire restaurant had gone silent. No clink of silverware, no murmur of conversation, even the soft jazz seemed to fade into the background. This was it, the moment everyone had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm so sorry for any—" David began, but Marcus cut him off with a raised hand. "This waitress has been deliberately antagonizing me all evening with that insipid smile. It's unprofessional. It's disrespectful. I want her gone. Tonight. Now." David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, his eyes darting between his most powerful customer and his employee. Emma stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, watching the scene unfold with an almost ethereal calm. "She's mocking me," Marcus continued, his voice rising with each word. "Nobody smiles like that unless they're simple or deranged, or deliberately trying to irritate their betters. Which is it?" He turned to Emma directly now, his eyes blazing with a fury that seemed wildly disproportionate to the situation. "Are you stupid? Is that it? Too dim to understand that your fake happiness is an insult to everyone who has to witness it? The cruelty of the words made several diners gasp audibly. A mother covered her young daughter's ears. An elderly man at the corner table half rose from his seat as if to intervene, but his wife pulled him back down. The air in the restaurant had become thick, oppressive, like the moment before a thunderclap. David cleared his throat, about to speak, to apologize, to offer free meals, anything to diffuse the situation. But Emma raised her hand slightly, a small gesture that somehow commanded attention. She took a single step forward, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and calm, carrying across the silent restaurant with the clarity of a bell. "I smile, Mr. Blackwood, because my mother is dying, and she told me that kindness is the only thing we can leave behind that truly matters." The words hung in the air like suspended droplets of rain, each one falling into the silence with devastating precision. Marcus Blackwood's mouth fell open slightly, his prepared tirade dying on his lips. The entire restaurant seemed to inhale collectively, processing what they'd just heard. Emma continued, her voice never wavering, that smile now tinged, with a sadness that made it more beautiful and more terrible than before. "Every morning I help her out of bed even though the cancer has made her bones so fragile I'm terrified I'll break her. Every evening I sit by her bedside and tell her about my day, and she always asks, 'Did you make someone smile today, Emma?' And I always say yes, because that's what keeps her fighting. That's what makes her believe the world is still worth staying in for another day." She paused, meeting Marcus's eyes directly. "So, yes, Mr. Blackwood, I smile, not because I'm simple or deranged, but because I've learned that when everything else is stripped away, money, power, position, the only thing that matters is how we treat each other in the brief time we have." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus Blackwood sat frozen, his face draining of color as if she'd slapped him. His hands, which had been clenched into fists, slowly relaxed, trembling, slightly. The other diners stared, transfixed by the raw honesty of the moment, by the dignity of this young woman who had just transformed an act of cruelty into something else entirely. A woman, at table 3, was crying quietly into her napkin. The businessman at the bar had turned away, his shoulders shaking slightly. Even David, the manager, stood speechless, his professional mask completely shattered. But Emma wasn't finished. She took another small step forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, yet somehow everyone could hear her perfectly. "I don't know what makes you so angry, Mr. Blackwood. I don't know what hurt you so badly that seeing someone else's happiness feels like an attack. But I want you to know that my smile isn't about you. It's not fake, it's not mockery, it's not performance, it's hope. It's the only currency I have in a world that values everything else more. And if that bothers you, perhaps the problem isn't with my smile." She let the words settle, then added with devastating gentleness, "Perhaps it's with what happened to yours." The transformation on Marcus Blackwood's face was like watching ice crack on a frozen lake. His eyes, which had been hard as flint, suddenly looked lost, almost frightened. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came. The armor of his arrogance, his wealth, his power, all of it seemed to crumble in the face of this simple truth delivered by a waitress he'd tried to humiliate. Around them, the restaurant held its collective breath, witnessing something none of them had expected: the complete and utter dissolution of a titan's rage in the face of genuine human grace. The king of the mountain had been felled not by another's strength, but by their kindness, and the avalanche that followed would reshape everything. Marcus Blackwood's hand trembled as he reached for his whiskey, but he couldn't lift it to his lips. The crystal tumbler sat there, catching the light, as his eyes remained fixed on some point beyond Emma, beyond the restaurant, beyond the present moment entirely. His face had gone pale, almost gray, and for the first time since he'd walked in, he looked every one of his 58 years. The other diners watched in stunned silence as this titan of industry seemed to shrink into his chair, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. Emma's words had stripped something away, torn through carefully constructed walls with surgical precision. In his mind, Marcus wasn't seeing the elegant restaurant anymore. He was seeing another dining room 40 years ago, cramped and dimly lit. His mother's smile as she served dinner after her third shift of the day, her feet swollen, her hands cracked from cleaning chemicals, but that smile never wavering. "We may not have much, Marcus," she'd say, "but we have each other, and that's everything." He'd hated that smile then, hated what it represented, their poverty, their struggle, their need to find joy in scraps while others feasted. He'd promised himself he'd never smile like that, never be satisfied with so little, never accept circumstances that required such desperate optimism. And he'd kept that promise, hadn't he? Built an empire, accumulated wealth beyond imagination, never smiled unless it was calculated, strategic, useful. But his mother's words echoed now, mixing with Emma's, creating a harmony he'd spent decades trying to silence. Kindness is the only thing we can leave behind that truly matters. The woman at table 3, Margaret Havensham, old money, older manners, stood up slowly. She walked over to Emma, ignoring the protocol, ignoring the unwritten rules of class and place, and took the young waitress's hand. "Thank you, dear," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "I needed to hear that tonight." The gesture broke. Something in the room, like the first crack in a dam. Others began to move, to speak, their voices soft but insistent. "She's right," someone whispered. "When did we forget that?" another voice added. The elderly man who'd tried to stand earlier was on his feet now, and he began to clap. Slowly, deliberately. The sound was joined by another pair of hands, then another. Not the dramatic applause of a performance, but something more profound. An acknowledgement, a recognition, a collective. Awakening to something they'd all lost sight of in their pursuit of reservations at the right restaurants, memberships at the right clubs, positions in the right circles. Marcus looked up at the sound, seeing the faces turned toward Emma, toward him, seeing judgment but also something else. Pity? Understanding? He couldn't tell anymore. His carefully ordered world was dissolving like sugar in rain. The phone in his pocket buzzed with what was certainly another $1 million decision waiting for his input, but for the first time in 20 years, he didn't reach for it. Instead, he watched Emma, really looked at her for the first time. Saw the fatigue behind the smile, the worry lines that shouldn't be on someone so young, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of exhaustion and fear and bills that kept her up at night. "Your mother," he said suddenly, his voice hoarse and strange. The applause died away as everyone turned to listen. What's her name?" Emma blinked, surprised by the question. "Grace. Her name is Grace." Marcus laughed then, a short, bitter sound that had no humor in it. "Of course it is." He was quiet for a long moment, then spoke again, his voice barely audible. "My mother died smiling, in a charity ward, still believing the world was good, still insisting that kindness mattered more than the empire I was building while she lay dying. I wasn't there. I was closing a deal in Tokyo, a very important deal." The sarcasm in those last words could have cut glass. David, the manager, stood frozen, completely out of his depth. This wasn't in any training manual, any protocol guide. The restaurant had become something else. A confessional, a therapy session, a moment of collective humanity that nobody had ordered but everyone seemed to need. Marcus's hands fumbled with his wallet, pulling out bills without counting them, laying them on the table. 500, 1,000, more. "For your mother," he said to Emma, not meeting her eyes. "For her medical bills." Emma shook her head gently. "Mr. Blackwood, I can't." But he was already standing, and for a moment everyone thought he would storm out, return to his fortress of glass and steel, rebuild his walls. Instead, he stopped, his back to Emma, his voice carrying despite its quietness. She was right, you know. Your mother. Mine, too. I spent 40 years proving them wrong, and all I proved was that I'd forgotten how to smile. He turned then, and for just a moment, the ghost of something that might have been a smile, real, painful, uncertain, flickered across his face. Don't forget, Emma. Don't become... He gestured at himself, unable to finish the sentence. Weight of unspoken years, unprocessed grief, and unacknowledged truths hung between them. This wasn't redemption. Not yet, maybe not ever. It was simply a crack in the armor, a moment of recognition, a successful businessman realizing that his success had cost him the very thing that made life worth succeeding for. The foundations of his empire hadn't shifted, but something inside him had, and everyone in that restaurant could feel it. The terrifying and liberating moment when a person's entire worldview begins to crumble. The collapse wasn't violent or dramatic. Marcus Blackwood didn't fall to his knees or break down sobbing. Instead, he simply stood there, looking older and smaller than anyone had ever seen him, the emperor realizing his empire was built on sand. His hand reached for the back of his chair to steady himself, and in that gesture was the entire weight of a life lived in pursuit of the wrong things. The shaking in his hands had spread to his whole body now, a tremor that spoke of foundations cracking, of certainties dissolving, of a man watching his carefully constructed identity fall apart in front of a room full of strangers. 40 years, he said to no one in particular, his voice hollow. 40 years of board meetings and hostile takeovers and power lunches, and not one person has ever looked at me the way they're looking at you. He gestured vaguely at Emma, at the room full of people who had witnessed her quiet strength. They fear me. They respect my money. They want what I can give them. But nobody... His voice cracked. Nobody smiles when they see me coming. The investment banker at table 8 shifted uncomfortably, recognizing himself in those words. The boutique owners, the ambassadors, the old money and new, they all saw themselves reflected in Marcus Blackwood's revelation. How many of them had traded their smiles for success? How many had forgotten that kindness was a currency more valuable than any stock portfolio? Emma stepped forward and did something that nobody expected. She pulled out a chair at a nearby empty table. "Would you like to sit down, Mr. Blackwood? You look tired." The simple humanity of the gesture broke something in him. Marcus Blackwood, who hadn't been offered simple kindness without an agenda in decades, sank into the chair like a man who'd been carrying the world and had finally been given permission to set it down. His shoulders shook once, twice, and then he was crying. Not dramatically, not with sobs, but with the quiet tears of a man who'd forgotten he could still feel. "I fired 300 people last Christmas," he confessed to the tablecloth. "By email. I told myself it was business, necessary, efficient. But really, I think I just wanted them to feel what I felt every Christmas after my mother died. That nothing mattered except the bottom line." Emma sat down across from him, this billionaire and this waitress, separated by every measure society used to divide people, yet connected by something more fundamental. She didn't speak, didn't offer, empty comfort. She just sat there, present, allowing him to feel what he needed to feel without judgment or agenda. The other diners began to return to their meals, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Conversations were softer, more genuine. The businessman at the bar called his daughter, told her he loved her. Margaret Havensham left her usual solitary table to join another woman dining alone. Small kindnesses rippled through the room like waves from a stone dropped in still water. "Your mother," Marcus said finally, wiping his face with a handkerchief that probably cost more than Emma made in a week. "Tell me about her." And Emma did. She told him about Grace's garden, how she insisted on tending it even when she could barely stand, about her collection of thank you cards from students she'd taught over 30 years, about how she sang in the shower even on chemo days, old songs from musicals that made her believe in happy endings. As she spoke, Marcus listened with an intensity usually reserved for billion-dollar deals, but this time he was learning something no business school had ever taught: the value of a life measured in love rather than dollars. "She sounds like my mother," he said when Emma finished. "Different circumstances, same spirit. The kind of person who made the world better just by being in it." He stood then, steadier now, though still fragile. The armor of his arrogance lay in pieces around him, and without it he looked almost human, vulnerable, real. He reached for the money on the table, but this time handed it to Emma properly, with eye contact, with recognition of her as a person rather than a problem. "Please, for Grace, tell her." He paused, searching for words. "Tell her thank you for raising someone who reminded me what smiling actually means." Emma accepted the money this time, understanding it wasn't charity but connection, not pity but recognition. "Mr. Blackwood," she said as he turned to leave. He stopped, looked back. "Yes." She smiled then, that same smile that had started all of this, but now he could see what it really was. Not mockery or performance, but a choice. A daily, hourly, minute-by-minute choice to believe that kindness mattered, that connection was possible, that even someone as lost as he was could find their way back to their own humanity. "It's never too late to remember how to smile," she said simply. "Your mother would want you to know that." Marcus Blackwood stood in the doorway of Le Bernardin, silhouetted against the city lights, a man worth billions who'd just been taught the value of something priceless. He nodded once, unable to speak, and then walked out into the New York night. But everyone who watched him go could see it. Something in his posture had changed. The emperor had fallen, but maybe, just maybe, a human being was learning to stand. The restaurant slowly returned to life after Marcus Blackwood's departure, but it was a different kind of life. Softer, more thoughtful, like the world had shifted slightly on its axis. Emma stood by the empty table for a moment, processing what had just happened before David approached her tentatively. "Emma, I don't know what to say. That was—" He trailed off, unable to find words for what they'd all witnessed. She touched his arm gently. "It's okay, David. I think we all needed that tonight." The rest of her shift passed in a blur of quiet congratulations and meaningful looks. Customers left larger tips than usual, not out of pity, but out of recognition. The kitchen staff sent out a special dessert for her, a small gesture that meant everything. Miguel hugged her at the end of the night, whispering, "Tu madre would be so proud," in her ear. As Emma counted her tips, including Marcus Blackwood's contribution, she realized she had enough to cover her mother's treatment for the next 2 months. But more than that, she had something to tell Grace that would make her smile through the pain. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the restaurant addressed to Emma. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a note in shaky handwriting. "For Grace's treatment." And Emma, "I smiled at someone today. A genuine smile. My secretary nearly fainted. Thank you for reminding me why that matters. MB." Attached was a business card with a personal cell number written on the back, and below it, "If you ever need anything at all." Emma never called the number, but 6 months later, when Grace passed away peacefully in her sleep, a garden appeared at the hospice where she'd spent her final days. A beautiful space with benches and flowering plants, with a small plaque that read, "The Grace Garden, where smiles are always welcome." Nobody official knew who'd paid for it, but Emma knew. And sometimes on her days off she'd see a familiar figure sitting alone on one of the benches, practicing something that still didn't come naturally to him but was getting easier each day. Smiling. At strangers, without agenda, without purpose except to share a moment of human connection. The story could have ended there, But life rarely provides such neat conclusions. Word of what happened at Le Bernardin spread through the city's elite circles, not as gossip, but as something else. A wake-up call, a mirror held up to their own lives. The investment banker from Table 8 started a fund for restaurant workers. Medical expenses. Margaret Havensham began volunteering at the hospice where Grace had stayed. Small changes, individual choices, ripples spreading outward from one moment of truth in a high-end restaurant. And Emma. She kept working, kept smiling, but now people saw it differently. Not as a service worker's obligation, but as an act of courage, a daily choice to believe in kindness despite everything. Regular customers began to open up to her, sharing their own struggles, their own losses, finding in her presence permission to be human in a world that so often demanded they be anything but. The restaurant became known for something more than its Michelin stars. It became a place where humanity happened, where the artificial barriers between people occasionally fell away. Years later, when Emma finally opened her own small cafe, with the help of an anonymous investor, she hung a simple sign by the door. Smiles welcome here. It became a gathering place for all sorts, billionaires and students, struggling artists and successful executives, all drawn by something they couldn't quite name but recognized when they felt it, the possibility of connection, the radical act of kindness, the revolutionary power of a genuine smile. Marcus Blackwood never fully transformed into someone else. Real change takes more than one moment of revelation. But he tried. He reinstated the workers he'd fired with apologies and back pay. He started arriving at board meetings with coffee for everyone, not just himself. He learned the names of the cleaning staff in his buildings. Small things, perhaps, but in aggregate, they added up to something like redemption, or at least the beginning of it. On the first anniversary of Grace's death, Emma found Marcus at her mother's grave, placing flowers with careful precision. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people from different worlds united by a single moment of truth. "She would have liked you," Emma said finally. Marcus almost smiled. It was getting easier now. "I think I would have liked her, too. Anyone who could raise someone like you, she must have been extraordinary." "She was ordinary," Emma corrected gently. "That's what made her extraordinary. She showed me that ordinary people doing ordinary kindnesses could change the world, one smile at a time." Marcus nodded, understanding now what he'd missed for so many years. That power wasn't about controlling others, but about connecting with them. That wealth meant nothing if you couldn't share it. That a smile, genuine, given freely, expecting nothing in return, was worth more than all the empires built on forgetting how to be human. As they walked away from the cemetery together, an unlikely pair bound by an even unlikelier moment, Emma smiled. Not because she had to, not because it was polite, but because despite everything, the loss, the struggle, the weight of the world, she still believed what her mother had taught her. Kindness was the only thing we leave behind that truly matters. And sometimes, just sometimes, a single smile could change everything. Even for billionaires who'd forgotten how, even for waitresses who'd never forgotten why. Even in a world that often seemed too broken to fix, one genuine moment of human connection at a time,